a human foot, a shod foot, but, strange to say, the ball alone appeared to have touched the ground. The marks are very numerous, close together, often crossing one another, but confined to a very small circle. Jasper Hobson called the attention of the rest of the party to this singular circumstance. "These were not made by a person walking," he said. "Nor by a person jumping," added Mrs Barnett, "for there is no mark of a heel." "No," said Mrs Joliffe, "these footprints were left by a dancer." She was right, as further examination proved. They were the marks left by a dancer, and a dancer engaged in some light and graceful exercise, for they were neither clumsy nor deep. But who could the light-hearted individual be who had been impelled to dance in this sprightly fashion some degrees above the Arctic Circle? "It was certainly not an Eskimo," said the lieutenant. "Nor an Indian," cried Corporal Joliffe. "No, it was a Frenchman," said Sergeant Long quietly, and all agreed that none but a Frenchman could have been capable of dancing on such a spot. Chapter 11. Part 1, Chapter 12 of The Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne, Part 1, Chapter 12. The Midnight Sun. Sergeant Long's assertion must appear to have been founded on insufficient evidence. That there had been dancing no one could deny, but that the dancer was a Frenchman, however probable, could not be considered proved. However, the lieutenant shared the opinion of his subordinate, which did not appear too positive to any of the party, who all agreed in feeling sure that some travellers, with at least one compatriot of Vestris amongst them, had recently encamped on this spot. Of course, Lieutenant Hobson was by no means pleased at this. He was afraid of having been preceded by rivals in the northwestern districts of English America, and secret as the company had kept its scheme, it had doubtless been divulged in the commercial centres of Canada and the United States. The lieutenant resumed his interrupted march, but he was full of care and anxiety, although he would not now have dreamed of retracing his steps. "Frenchmen are then sometimes met with in these high latitudes?" was Mrs Barnett's natural question after this incident. "Yes, madam," replied the lieutenant, "or if not exactly Frenchmen, the descendants of the masters of Canada when it belonged to France, which comes to much the same thing. These men are in fact our most formidable rivals." "But I thought," resumed Mrs Barnett, "that after the absorption by the Hudson's Bay Company of the old North-West Company, that it had no longer any rivals on the American continent." "Although there is no longer any important association for trading in furs except our own, there are a good many perfectly independent private companies, mostly American, which have retained French agents or their descendants in their employ." "Are these agents then held in such high esteem?" asked Mrs Barnett. "Yes, madam, and with good reason. During the 94 years of French supremacy in Canada, French agents always proved themselves superior to ours. We must be just, even to our rivals." "Especially to our rivals," added Mrs Barnett. "Yes, especially. At that time French hunters, starting from Montreal, their headquarters, pressed on to the north with greater hardihood than any others. They lived for years with the Indian tribes, sometimes intermarrying with them. The natives called them the Canadian travellers, and were on the most intimate terms with them. They were bold, clever fellows, expert at navigating streams, light-hearted and merry, adapting themselves to circumstances with the easy flexibility of their race, and always ready to sing or dance." "And do you suppose that hunting is the only object of the party whose traces we have just discovered?" "I don't think any other hypotheses at all likely," replied Hobson. "They are sure to be seeking new hunting grounds, but as we cannot possibly stop them, we must make haste to begin our own operations, and compete boldly with all rivals." Lieutenant Hobson was now prepared for the competition he could not prevent, and he urged on the march of his party as much as possible, hoping that his rivals might not follow him beyond the 70th parallel. The expedition now descended towards the south for some 20 miles, in order the more easily to pass around Franklin Bay. The country was still covered with verdure, and the quadrupeds and birds already enumerated were as plentiful as ever, so that they could reasonably hope that the whole of the northwest coasts of the American continent were populated in the same manner. The ocean which bathed these shores stretched away as far as the eye could reach. Recent atlases give no land beyond the North American coastline, and it is only the icebergs which impede the free navigation of the open sea from Bering Strait to the Pole itself. On the 4th of July, the travelers skirted around another deep bay called Washburn Bay, and reached the furthest point of a little lake, until then imperfectly known, covering but a small extent of territory, scarcely 2 square miles. In fact, it was rather a lagoon, or large pond of sweet water, than a lake. The sledges went on easily and rapidly, and the appearance of the country was most encouraging to the explorers. It seemed that the extremity of Cape Bathurst would be a most favourable site for the new fort, as with this lagoon behind them, and the sea open for 4 or 5 months in the warm season, and giving access to the great highway of the Bering Strait before them, it would be easy for the exiles to lay in fresh provisions and to export their commodities. On 5th June, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the party at last halted at the extremity of Cape Bathurst. It remained to ascertain the exact position of this cape, which the maps place above the 70th parallel. It was, however, impossible to rely upon the marine surveys of the coast, as they had never yet been made with exactitude. Jasper Hobson decided to wait and ascertain the latitude and longitude. "What prevents us from settling here?" asked Corporal Joliffe. "You will own, Lieutenant, that it is a very inviting spot." "It will be more inviting still if you get double pay here, my worthy Corporal," replied Hobson. "No doubt," said Joliffe, "and the orders of the company must be obeyed." "Then wait patiently till tomorrow," added Hobson, "and if we find that Cape Bathurst is really beyond 70° north latitude, we will pitch our tent here." The site was indeed admirably suited for the foundation of a new settlement. The wooded heights surrounding the lagoon would supply plenty of pine, birch, and other woods for the construction of the fort, and for stocking it with fuel. The lieutenant and some of his companions went to the very edge of the cape, and found that towards the west the coastline formed a lengthened curve, beyond which icebergs of a considerable height shut out the view. The water of the lagoon, instead of being brackish as they expected from its close vicinity to the sea, was perfectly sweet, but had it not been so, drinkable water would not have failed the little colony, as a fresh and limpid stream ran a few yards to the southeast of Cape Bathurst, and emptied itself into the Arctic Ocean through a narrow inlet, which, protected by a singular accumulation of sand and earth, instead of by rocks, would have afforded a refuge to several vessels from the winds of the offing, and might be turned to account for the anchorage of the ships which it was hoped would come to the new settlement from Bering Strait. Out of compliment to the lady of the party, and much to her delight, Lieutenant Hobson named the stream Paulina River, and the little harbour Port Barnett. By building the fort a little behind the actual cape, the principal house and the magazines would be quite sheltered from the coldest winds. The elevation of the cape would help to protect them from the snowdrifts, which sometimes completely bury large buildings beneath their heavy avalanches in a few hours. There was plenty of room between the foot of the promontory and the bank of the lagoon for all the construction necessary to a fort. It could even be surrounded by palisades, which would break the shock of the icebergs, and the cape itself might be surrounded with a fortified redoubt, if the vicinity of rivals should render such a purely defensive erection necessary. And the lieutenant, although with no idea of commencing anything of the kind as yet, naturally rejoiced at having met with an easily defensible position. The weather remained fine, and it was quite warm enough. There was not a cloud upon the sky, but of course the clear blue air of temperate and torrid zones could not be expected here, and the atmosphere was generally charged with a light mist. What would Cape Bathurst be like in the long winter nights of 4 months, when the ice mountains became fixed and rigid, and the hoarse north wind swept down upon the icebergs in all its fury? None of the party gave a thought to that time now, for the weather was beautiful, the verdant landscape smiled, and the waves sparkled in the sunbeams, whilst the temperature remained warm and pleasant. A provisional camp, the sledges forming its only material, was arranged for the night on the banks of the lagoon, and towards evening Mrs Barnett, the lieutenant, Sergeant Long, and even Thomas Black explored the surrounding district in order to ascertain its resources. It appeared to be in every respect suitable, and Hobson was eager for the next day, that he might determine the exact situations, and find out if it fulfilled the conditions imposed by the company. "Well, Lieutenant," said the astronomer, when the examination was over, "this is really a charming spot, such as I should not have imagined could have existed beyond the Arctic Circle." "Ah, Mr Black," cried Hobson, "the finest countries in the world are to be found here, and I am impatient to ascertain our latitude and longitude." "Especially the latitude," said the astronomer, whose eclipse was never out of his thoughts, "and I expect your brave companions are as eager as yourself. Double pay beyond the 70th parallel." "But, Mr Black," said Mrs Barnett, "do you not yourself take an interest, a purely scientific interest, in getting beyond that parallel?" "Of course, madam, of course. I am anxious to get beyond it, but not so terribly eager. According to our calculations, however, made with absolute accuracy, the solar eclipse which I am ordered to watch will only be total to an observer placed beyond the 70th degree, and on this account I share the lieutenant's impatience to determine the position of Cape Bathurst." "But I understand, Mr Black," said Mrs Barnett,
Landing.
"that this solar eclipse will not take place until the 18th July, 1860. "Yes, madam, on the 18th July, 1860. "And it is now only the 15th June, 1859, so that the phenomenon will not be visible for more than a year." "I am quite aware of it, Mrs Barnett," replied the astronomer, "but if I